Hello, everybody. Today, topic 12, soil fertility management for Introduction to Soil Science. So the first place we're going to start is we're going to talk about plant tissue analysis. So plant analysis, we're sampling live plant material, and almost all micronutrients and sulfur are tested using plant tissue analysis, not soil analysis. The micronutrients are very affected by soil pH, by organic matter, by clay content, and other nutrients that can be plenty available in the soil, but maybe not really available to the plant. So it's much more accurate in terms of trying to figure out what's happening with the plant if we look at the plant rather than looking at the soil, if we're specifically looking at the micronutrients. There's different protocols for different crops and nutrients. The sample portions can include the leaves, the petioles, some portions of the stems, sometimes the flowers, but very rare. And the plant's got to be sampled at certain stages of development. Usual procedure, sample portions are washed, dried, and then ground up before the testing. When we have our plant tissue analysis, the interpretation of it is actually difficult. So I think that's why most people prefer the idea of the soil analysis, because it's easier to interpret. You can understand information more if you do plant tissue analysis, but you have to be really skilled to really understand it. A couple of the reasons are the hidden hunger area and the idea of CNR, or critical nutrient ranges. So with hidden hunger, that's when your plants are not showing deficiency symptoms, but the yield is being reduced. Whereas the critical nutrient ranges is a vague area between hidden hunger and sufficiency, and it's still kind of under debate. But the one thing to understand is the balance of nutrients is important, not the total nutrients. And so let's take a look at this curve right here. So in terms of available nutrients, too little is not good, too much is not good, just right is what we're looking for in order to be able to promote plant growth and health. And so that hidden hunger in CNR, you'd see that right before this deficiency range and into the sufficiency a little bit. And so it's kind of complicated to understand. So it's much easier to deal with soil analysis than it is plant tissue analysis. But if we really want to know about those micronutrients, we can get more information from the plant tissue analysis. So when we're trying to diagnose nutrient deficiencies, we want to think about mobile nutrients. So they're easily extracted from the older tissues. Symptoms will show up there first. So which ones are mobile nutrients? Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and then also magnesium. Those ones are the mobile ones, so the symptoms usually show up there first. You got fairly immobile nutrients, and then you also have completely immobile nutrients. So fairly immobile, so ones that are it's not easily extracted. So the problems will show up on younger tissue and younger leaves first. So that's your copper, your iron, your zinc, and your sulfur. The ones where it's completely immobile, so your calcium and boron, you can't extract it from older tissues at all. So you're only going to see the symptoms on the growing points, like the buds or the leaf tips are the only places where you'll see those issues. So that goes back to really understanding when we're looking at a plant and seeing what problem might be happening. And so on the right here, we've got this graphic where you can kind of, it's a flow chart. So, if I see this symptom, go to here. If I see that one, go to there. And you start kind of figuring out which one of the nutrients will be problematic. In terms of common visual deficiency symptoms, the most common one people are used to seeing, like this plant on the right, is chlorosis, where you have the yellowing of the tissues. The yellowing is a lack of chlorophyll in the leaf, and you can have possible causes being poor drainage, damaged roots, compacted roots, high alkalinity in the soil, or some sort of nutrient deficiency. All those can cause chlorosis. So it's not as cut and dry as saying, okay, well then it's definitely this. Well, it could be this and that, or it could be just this other thing. Another thing we'll see is necrosis, so actually death of the tissue, and it's usually caused to the death of the cells within the plant tissue. And usually you see a black or a brown color, just like this picture on the right, where you can actually see a little bit of black and brown in those spots, and so that part of the plant has actually died. Another one you might see is mottling. So you'll see curling and bumping up of tissue. So not just the idea that that it's yellowed or that it died, but you also see that the leaf will curl or it'll get bumps in it. So when we say mottling, a pattern of irregular marks, spots, streaks, blotches, or patches of different shades or colors. What are the most common plant nutrient deficiencies? The number one, and hopefully you know this by now because it's the most essential for a reason, and it's the one that it's hardest to tell the levels of it in the soil, like we had in our one lab, where they don't even test for it because the levels just vary so much. So nitrogen. Nitrogen would be the most common plant nutrient deficiency because the levels of nitrogen can change in the soil. They can fluctuate quite a lot. Symptoms of nitrogen deficiency are general chlorosis of the lower leaves, and then stunted and slow growth, and possibly even necrosis in older leaves, but that's usually severe cases. Right here we see row corn, and we've got a nitrogen deficiency. We see on the right, or look on the left, and notice the yellowing of the leaves. So if you say, well, up top, that's just the sunlight. I'm not looking at the top. What I want you to do is look at the bottom left, at the very lower leaves on the row, and you'll see that the underside of those leaves is yellow. So that's not sunlight hitting the underside of those leaves on the left. That's chlorosis. And then on the right, you can see where it's already become problematic because those leaves are already dead. Our second most common plant nutrient deficiency, can you guess it? It's phosphorus. Phosphorus deficient plants generally turn dark green, both the leaves and the stems, and they can appear stunted. The older leaves are affected first, and may acquire a kind of a purplish color to them. So if you look at the picture on the right there, you can see, I mean, for me, I say, oh, it's brown looking, but I could totally see how it comes out like with a kind of a purplish hue to it. And that's due to accumulation of sugars, and then in some cases the leaf tips will brown and die. Or with the picture in the top right, just basically like the outside, the margin of a leaf will die first, and then it kind of works its way in. Third most common plant nutrient deficiency. Well, remember, these three that we just taught, the first two that we talked about are essential macronutrients. And so the third one would have to be our third essential macronutrient. So potassium. Potassium deficiencies do not immediately show up with visible symptoms. So that would fall into that hidden hunger category. Initially, there's usually just a reduction in growth rate, maybe some chlorosis, maybe some necrosis. Following that, older leaves will show some mottling or chlorotic areas and give kind of a leaf burn at the margin. So remember the picture we just looked at in terms of phosphorus. You can see the picture here on the left where we got this is more of leaf burn than that necrosis, because it doesn't quite have that brown death look to it, but it looks like it's having issues. Fourth one, that would be the other one we talked about earlier, magnesium. So it's one of our secondary nutrients. The symptoms of magnesium deficiency include intervenal chlorosis. So on the left there, you see the low magnesium, and you see how you can see the veins of the leaves, and you can see some areas in between the veins where it's yellow and some areas where it's green. Sometimes it might even become like reddish purple, but and you can kind of see that happening at the bottom of that leaf on the left. You can see there's a very few areas towards the apex or the tip of the leaf where it's got like a darker color to it, but the midrib is definitely still green. And then on the right, you can see what that leaf should look like. Here, this example, I like this one because it shows us our nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium deficiencies within a corn plant. So healthy corn plant on the top. The middle one, the next one down the list is with nitrogen deficiency, with the mid vein being problematic. The one below that, that's our phosphorus deficiency. We get that red purple kind of that the outside of it to be damaged. And then potassium, you get more of that, like what we call that leaf burn, where it's got that brownish yellowish look on the outside around the leaf margins. So here's some quiz questions. I like to include those into the lectures just to kind of keep you guys thinking. So make sure you review those questions, and remember, you can always pause the lecture at any time. Write down the questions, write down your answers, write down any questions you might have for me at some point in time. Here's a few more questions for you. And a few more. So this right here, I know it kind of gives you the answer, but I talked about it earlier last lecture. So last lecture, I showed you the same graphic, but showed you it with a little more description. And so now just the idea of what the other deficiencies might look like. So we see our NPK deficiencies. Those ones we're comfortable with because we just talked about them. But then also here's our secondary nutrients. So we've got our magnesium, calcium, and sulfur. And then we also have our micronutrients, so our boron, our zinc, and our molybdenum, iron, copper, and just all these different deficiencies that the plant can show. So if you see any of these things, start thinking and start trying to have this in the back of your head as to these are the problems that the plant might be going through. So in terms of soil fertility, what are we trying to talk about? Well, I've included on the bottom here, and you can always pause if you're following along with the PDF lecture slides and click on the video that I have linked below here. That'll give you a nice little video introduction of what we're going to talk about. But for me, we're talking about what are we doing to the ground? How are we going to fertilize the ground? How are we going to increase the fertility of the ground when we're talking about soil fertility? So fertilizers are the most commonly applied soil amendment. The soil amendment just being something that we're using to increase the fertility of the land or maintain the fertility of the land. Like pesticides, fertilizers are necessary evils of modern production agriculture. If you're going to do ecosystem simplification like agriculture is, and you're going to create one specific plant in such large quantities, you're going to need to use fertilizer because it's not going to be what naturally that ecosystem wants to do. You do have to realize, though, that there is a certain point where it's okay and a certain point where it's not okay, because overuse of fertilizers is, one, going to be expensive, and then two, going to be environmentally hazardous. And either one of those things are things that we're looking to avoid. We don't want to. We want to be efficient. We don't want to spend a lot of money, and we don't want to hurt the environment if we don't have to. Modern techniques in terms of farming allow people to measure and apply the right amount of fertilizers And we'll really get into that in detail with the new technology in terms of the last lecture in the class. But really the focus with fertilizers is being efficient, maximizing profit, maintaining soil health, keeping the environment and productivity in balance. So let's talk about some goals and some concerns of fertility management. The number one goal, if we're going to do this, is the idea that you're trying to maximize profitability. So on average, 20% of total costs and raise the yield 50%. You're really trying to maximize your profitability. You're never going to add fertilizer if it doesn't increase the value per acre of your crop. That means you got to know your limiting factors, because you really need to put the right fertilizer if you're not going to waste money. In many soils, nutrients are naturally released in large enough amounts for commercial crop production. So you shouldn't have to put every type of fertilizer on there. It should be one specific type of fertilizer that's going to make up for what the most limiting nutrients are. Another goal that you'll have is to improve the quality of your crop, especially with fruits and vegetables. Whenever I go to the grocery store, I see people at the grocery store as well. They're touching everything. They're looking at it, and if there's any bumps or bruises or anything, it goes right back. So people are really picky. If you're gonna be selling food, people are really picky about how it looks. You also want it to taste good and have good nutrition. Good nutrition is also important for disease resistance, drought tolerance, digestibility of forages, the sugar contents of fruits, the general color and flavor, all those sorts of things. So you want it to be nutritious as well. We want to prevent environmental pollution. We know that fertilizers are problematic. The big thing is not doing it in such a large amount or in such a wasteful way that it causes problems to the environment. The main problem being water contamination. And one way we're going to really try and understand soil fertility is through soil sampling, mostly just for the macronutrients, but then also looking at electrical conductivity and also looking at the pH of the soil. So our first step in that process would be to determine the areas and the time to be sampled. You want to look for, the field might not have uniform soil attributes, so you may have to sample in different spaces. If it's irrigated, one field with one crop will do. For new land, sample yearly at the beginning, and then every 3 years if you're not changing your cropping system. You want to make maps. You want to look for areas that might be different, and you want to just try and sample it as best you can and get a good sample of your whole area. Your second step in the soil sampling process would be to determine the number and the position of the samples. So if it's a large uniform area, you can go one sample every 20 acres. You usually need about a pint of each sample, and then you want to bag it and you want to label it with the place, the time, the collector, the depth, any other useful information. For areas that aren't uniform, you might need subsampling, so you might need multiple samples within a bigger sample. And it really just depends on the nutrient of interest. Step 3 in our soil sampling process, determine the depth of sampling. So there's really only one rule with that. Take samples within the volume of soil surrounding absorbing roots and where roots will be absorbing during that growing season that you're sampling in. So for annual crops, anywhere from the surface to 6 inches. Anything else doesn't make any sense because they're not going to put in roots deeper than 6 inches. If you're looking at perennial vines, forages, or shrubs, you want to go from the surface to 2 feet down. And then for trees, it can be variable, but usually from the surface to about 3 feet into the ground. So that's really your general guideline in terms of how deep you want to go. You really just have to know what is it you're looking for, which plant is of interest. In terms of soil testing, the two things we'd be looking for really are pH, which is our hydrogen ion concentration, and then our soluble salts in terms of our amount of salts that will dissolve in our soil water. So trying to figure out if we have salt-affected soils or not, and then also what is the pH, because we know how much pH matters. And do we have an acidic soil? Do we have a basic or alkaline soil? Or does our pH fall into that beautiful, wonderful 6.5 to 7.5 range where we can grow crops really easily? pH is really important for determining the lime requirement for much more acidic soils in the eastern U.S. And then in terms of our soluble salts, not all salts will dissolve, so relative amounts in different areas are important. And most of this is done using saturated paste extract. So you basically fill all the soil pores with water for 24 hours, and then water is removed through the suction process, and then that's put on this saturated paste extract. You can also do nitrogen soil testing and phosphorus soil testing, and the reason for that is the idea that those are your two most important or two most essential macronutrients. So you can't measure, even doing the nitrogen testing as nitrate, you can't measure all the nitrogen in the soil. So you kind of just compare it to a standard that you have. About 200 pounds per acre extracted for nitrate is adequate for most crops, whereas for phosphorus, there's 4 different methods to test. It's not too accurate if the soil is high in organic matter, but your kind of standard is 150 pounds per acre for most crops. Then there's also potassium testing, sulfur testing, boron testing. And you can kind of see the differences there. For potassium, our number is more like 208 pounds per acre. It's considered adequate for most crops. In terms of interpretation of these results, the labs will give the growers interpretation sheets, and then they'll basically say deficiency and sufficiency ranges. And hopefully you guys have seen that with the assignments that I've provided in the last couple of weeks in terms of our lab assignments, and being able to look at a soil report and seeing the different things that they suggest in the range and the idea of high, medium, and low within the soil. This was something we talked about a little bit last week, but we'll go into a little more detail. The idea of the fertilizer bags and the labeling on the fertilizer. And so usually what we'll see is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, or NPK is our usual, and it's a percentage of each of those things within the bag. You'll also see the weight of the bag and the manufacturer. So in our example here, we've got our 10-10-10, so that's 10% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, 10% potassium. And so this is a 50-pound bag, and GrowMax is our company. Some states will require the percentages and the composition of filler material. Like if there's a clay in there, they might also require you to put the pH, salts, or some other stats on the bag as well. So here's another example. So we see 22-3-4. It's always NPK. So this one has 22% nitrogen, 3% phosphorus, 14% potassium. Sometimes you'll get the S as well there on the front of the bag. The nitrogen is usually pure nitrogen. Potassium is phosphate, and the phosphorus comes as phosphate, and the potassium is potash. And the percent sulfur, if they've got sulfur on there, is pure sulfur. And that's kind of the basics of it. It's not It's not super complicated. Now, what gets complicated is when you have to apply this into calculations, and that's what you're working on in lab this week. But hopefully you don't find that to be too difficult. So, some basics. If we're talking about fertilizers and pH, some fertilizers can dramatically change the pH of the soil. Generally, phosphorus and potassium are neutral to slightly basic. Nitrogen fertilizers can make soil highly acidic, especially ammonia fertilizers, and then sulfur fertilizers can also make soil acidic. Our fertilizer efficiency, that would be the percent added fertilizer that's actually used by the plant. So that's one of the ways to try and get to how well is this fertilizer being used, is what is the plant actually taking up. But it's going to depend on the clay content of the soil. It's going to depend on the organic matter, the pH, the microbes, the irrigation efficiency or rainfall pattern, the original nutrient concentration. So you can see how that could get complicated. One of the things I think, or one of the big concerns I think people have with fertilizers is this efficiency right now. Because if we're looking at our fertilizer efficiency in general, for nitrogen, you're around 30 to 70% for nitrogen. You're around 5 to 30% for phosphorus, and somewhere between 50 to 80 for potassium. So there's still a lot that's just getting kind of wasted. And so I think it's a similar idea with irrigation, where we don't really have super efficient methods, and that's what makes it difficult for people. Right down here at the bottom, got a quick example of calculating application rates. So if I say something like I have an NPK and it's 45, 0, and 0, and I want to apply 150 pounds per acre of pure nitrogen, that means nitrogen's the element I want to focus on. So I'm going to look at that 45 there. And so I got to remember, okay, so that's 45% nitrogen. So I've got 150 pounds per acre. So 150 pounds divided by 45. No, wait, it's not 45. It's 0.45 because it's 45%. That gives me 333 pounds per acre that I'm going to have to do to apply that 4500 NPK fertilizer. So how do I apply fertilizer? So there's 4 kind of basic application techniques. So you got your starter, which you add it with seed at planting. The nitrogen portion gets used and leached very quickly this way. Broadcast, that's something you'll hear a lot, which is basically it's just put uniform all over the surface. It's only used in solid seeded crops, not in row or orchard crops. But it's also used as emergency applications over established crops where large amounts are needed fast. Banding, that happens under the soil surface in strips at the side or below the seeding. That's fairly efficient. It's best for phosphorus and potassium because it doesn't leach fast. And then there's also top dressing, which it's placed over the top of growing seedlings. And it's really good for nitrogen, not as good for phosphorus and potassium because they'll leach too fast. Here's just some examples of that, of seed being put out. On the bottom left here, you can see there's the seed furrow, and so then we're fertilizing off in the other furrows. You can see a little bit of a broadcast there in the top right with the spray just going uniformly over the back there. Same thing on the bottom right. We got 2 other application techniques. So foliar, so being applied specifically to the leaves, and that's going to be best for the micronutrients. It's hard to absorb enough macros though through the leaves. So if we're really focusing on micronutrients, a foliar application is going to work well, but not if we're focused on that NPK. Foliar applications can be used for citrus. You can have them through the air, like through a crop duster or an orchard sprayer, where you have a large vehicle that's kind of spraying over the top and spraying down onto the crop. So, for example, oranges get sprayed 3 or 4 times a year with what's called a total nutrient solution of nitrogen, potassium, zinc, iron, and manganese. Chelates. Now, I said that wrong in an earlier lecture, but that word is chelates, with a wetting agent to make solutions stick to the leaves. And then another one that's becoming much more common is the idea of fertigation. And if you listen to the word and you're like, fertigation, was that like fertilizer with irrigation? Yeah, exactly. You're applying the fertilizer through the irrigation water. And it's becoming much more common here, especially for vineyards and orchards. You do need special fertilizer formulations, because if you need them to be highly soluble, you don't want it to be ruining your equipment, because farm equipment's super expensive, super difficult to put in, and you don't want to be changing and trying to fix that stuff yearly, because it's going to raise your costs up high. And remember, maximizing profitability is one of our big goals and our most important goal in terms of fertilizing. You get very good application efficiency through fertigation. You do need expensive injection machinery with many safety devices to make sure, though, that you're not providing environmental contamination, because we are putting it in the water, and water contamination could be a huge problem with fertilizer. And so here is a graphic showing the idea of fertilizer versus fertigation. So conventional fertilization for some places can even be people just coming out and putting fertilizer on a crop, and plants might get a larger dosage of fertilizer than they need, might not get it at the right time. Whereas fertigation, it's applied according to the needs of the nutrients, following the uptake rate of the crop, and really makes it a little more accurate in terms of the plant getting it where and when it needs the fertilizer. This graphic right here is kind of the whole fertigation process and everything that's involved within it. So we can see our farmer over there by 4B and all the different things he's got. So he's got some orchard crops, he's got some row crops, he's got some flower beds, and he's got even some indoor stuff going. He's got his whole fertigation unit over in this housing unit over here. He's got a disinfection unit. He's got a drainage water tank. And he's got a water tank over there pumping water from the lakes or the ponds. And he's trying to really make sure that this whole system works and does exactly what it needs to in terms of getting the plants both the irrigation that they need and the possible fertilizers that they need to grow the best and be as efficient as possible in terms of growing good, nutritious food. Here's some more examples of the idea of fertigation. So on the top left here, we got a sprayer rig that's out there spraying, irrigating the crops, but also spraying in the fertilizer. And then you can kind of see just more of a setup system down there on the bottom left, and kind of a detailed graphic of what, a little bit of what that looks like in terms of the bottom left on the right there. The graphic of how that whole system's working. You can also have split applications, so repeated small applications of fertilizer. So you don't have to do the same thing over and over again. You can do it differently. So sometimes you can get like a small frequent dose versus a large dose. Good for things like nitrogen and sulfur. This will help keep the nutrients in the root zone, and applies to most of the application techniques. You don't have to always do it the same exact way every single time. So, once again, quiz questions. Take your time, really think about them, see if you can answer them, get yourself ready for that next test that we got coming up. And as always, if you got questions, you can ask me questions, and I will do my best to answer them. There's our soil fertility lecture. Until next time.